I was working a late DoorDash shift that night, something I did often enough that the darkness didn't bother me anymore. Milwaukee after midnight could be quiet, almost peaceful, if you didn't think too hard about what could be waiting in the shadows. I was used to the stillness, the way the streets stretched empty like they'd been abandoned long ago. Around 1:15 a.m., I finally got a ping on my phone, an order from the 24/7 McDonald's a few miles from where I was parked, half asleep behind the wheel. I didn't even check the drop-off address before hitting accept. Honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted the night to move faster. I picked up the food, the usual greasy bag of fries and double cheeseburgers, then let the app guide me to the destination. 15 minutes. Not bad. I started driving, windows down, music low, one hand on the wheel. The city lights thinned out as I drove north, and the buildings started looking older, rougher, like no one had cared about them in decades. It didn't click right away that this part of town wasn't on my regular route. The streets narrowed, trees overhung the road. The GPS had me make a few weird turns and finally took me into what looked like a business complex. Or maybe it used to be. Whatever it was, it had clearly seen better days. The office buildings looked more like tombs, the kind of places you imagine someone disappearing into, never to come back out. I pulled into a cracked parking lot choked with weeds, the kind of place that had been forgotten by time and maintenance crews. The building I stopped in front of was one story, all cinder block and grime, with windows so dirty they looked painted. My phone buzzed with a message. I saw you pull in. Go to the gray metal door on your left. Just bring it inside. I glanced around, and sure enough, there it was. Plain, gray, no sign, no windows. It didn't even look like it had been used in years. But I'd done office deliveries before. Graveyard shifts, janitors, security guards. It wasn't weird for someone to ask for a drop-off at the back. I got out, grabbed the bag, and walked toward the door. The night air was heavy. It smelled like rain and rot. I reached for the handle and gave it a tug. It wasn't locked. It creaked open like it hated to be disturbed. Inside there was a hallway. No overhead lights, just small bulbs recessed into the walls, spaced out enough to create long shadows, the kind that make you think something's lurking just between pools of light. I stepped inside, already uneasy, and let the door close behind me. I hadn't taken more than a few steps when my phone vibrated again. Another message. Just bring it inside for me. No name, no thank you. I hesitated. Something felt off. This wasn't a lobby. There was no counter, no sign of a reception desk, just a long corridor leading to God knows where. I turned to leave and tried the handle. Nothing. The door didn't move. I pulled harder, then slammed my shoulder into it. Still nothing. My heart dropped. That door hadn't locked on its own. Someone had locked me in. I don't remember dropping the food, but I heard it hit the floor. My throat went dry. I pulled out my phone again to call the customer, but there was no signal. Of course. That was the moment I heard it, a door slamming shut, somewhere deep in the building. The sound echoed like a gunshot in my skull. Then came footsteps, heavy, deliberate, getting closer. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, only that I needed distance. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. I reached the end and found another door. It opened to a second corridor, this one lined with office rooms, all of them dark. Some with open doors. I ducked into one of them and crouched behind an overturned desk. My breath sounded too loud in the silence. Then, I heard it. The footsteps. They entered the hallway I'd just left. Fast, like someone running. They passed my hiding spot and kept going. That was my chance. I bolted the opposite direction, my footsteps echoing behind me like ghosts chasing shadows. I found another door and threw my weight into it. It gave. I stumbled out into the night, lungs burning. My car was still there, undisturbed. I didn't even check behind me. I just jumped in, slammed the door, and peeled out of that lot. I didn't stop until I hit the freeway. I called the cops from a gas station 10 minutes away, still shaking. They told me to wait. An officer arrived 20 minutes later, took my statement, nodded a lot, looked vaguely interested. But when he ran a check on the building, he told me what I'd already feared. There hadn't been a business operating there in over 5 years. No tenants, no leases, just a dead property slowly rotting away on the books. No cameras, no one saw me go in, no one saw me come out, and they didn't find anyone inside. I asked if they were going to investigate, but the officer just said, "There's nothing to investigate unless you got a name." I didn't. The number the customer used? Burner, already disconnected. I drove home with the windows rolled up, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds like a man waiting for a shadow to follow him home. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I slept the night after either. It's been over a year since that night, and I haven't taken another late night delivery since. I think about it all the time though. Not just the part where I was locked in, not just the footsteps. It's the question that eats at me. The one I try to bury but always comes back up at 2 a.m. when the house is too quiet and the wind rattles the siding. What would have happened if I hadn't run? What was waiting for me at the end of that hallway? I never found out, and I pray I never do. People always say, once something terrifying happens to you, something real, not imagined, you start to see the world differently. You notice things you would have ignored before. You flinch when the wind moves wrong. You never park facing a dead Sem. After what happened to me at that old office building, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily I'd walked into that trap. One message, one door, and I was inside someone else's game. I got lucky, I got out. But some people aren't that lucky. I know because I met one of them a few months later at a car wash of all places. I was wiping down my front windshield, still checking the back seat out of habit, when a guy pulled up next to me in an old rust-colored Toyota. He looked young, mid-20s, bags under his eyes like he hadn't slept in a week. We started talking, small stuff, how DoorDash sucks after dark, how no one tips anymore. Then, he told me about a delivery he made to a place called Frosted Oak Cabins. I don't think I blinked the whole time he talked. His name was Elijah Monroe. This is his story, not mine, but the way he told it, I felt like I was right there with him. He said it was late on a Thursday. He'd been working for Domino's about 3 months, mostly night shifts, trying to cover rent. That night was quiet, until a weirdly timed order came in around 11:45 p.m. It was 1 large pepperoni, 1 veggie, and a 2-liter of Sprite. Paid online, no tip. The address wasn't somewhere he recognized, which was rare. Most late-night orders came from the same apartment blocks or college housing. This one was out on the edge of town, down a gravel road that looked more like a fire trail than an actual street. The further he drove, the fewer lights he saw. After about 10 minutes, the trees got thicker, and eventually the road split into 5 narrow paths. A wooden sign marked the place, Frosted Oak Cabins. Elijah said the sign looked old, but not abandoned, more like forgotten. He checked the order again. Cabin 3, each path had a little wooden post with a number nailed to it, and he found the one that said 3, tucked between 2 overgrown hedges. The path was too narrow for the car, so he parked under a flickering lamppost, grabbed the pizzas, and started walking. He told me the lights were the worst part. There were little lantern-style bulbs strung along the path, but they were spaced out so far that it was like stepping between islands of safety. You'd be in the light for 2 seconds, then plunge back into the dark until you reached the next one. It messed with his sense of direction. Every crunch of leaves, every rustle of branches felt closer than it probably was. The woods were still, he said, but not quiet. They breathed around him. Elijah walked for what felt like forever, probably 4 minutes, though he said it felt like 20, until he reached a small clearing. There it was, cabin number 3, tiny, single story, completely dark. No lights on, no porch lamp, not even the glow of a phone screen behind a curtain. He walked up the creaky steps and knocked. No answer. Knocked again. The echo was the only reply. He pulled out his phone, checked the order, and called the number listed. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. He was about to head back to the car when a message buzzed in. Not home. Doors open. Please leave food on table inside. Elijah said. He paused. His gut twisted. He didn't want to go in, but it was cold, and he didn't want to drag the pizzas all the way back to the store. So he put his hand on the knob. It turned. The door creaked open, revealing a single-room cabin, pitch black inside. "Hello?" he called. Nothing. Just the sound of air settling and wood creaking beneath its own weight. He used his phone light to scan the room. There was a table by the far wall. He took a few hesitant steps inside, the smell of mildew hitting him immediately. The air was still, like it had been sealed for weeks. He set the pizzas on the table, then turned to leave. That's when he heard it, the soft creak of a door hinge. He spun around, phone light shaking in his hand, just in time to see the bedroom door swing open. A man stepped out, not slowly, not cautiously, like he had been waiting. Elijah said he tried to speak, something like, "Hey, I was just dropping this off." But the man didn't respond. He just kept walking, faster with every step, his face blank at first, then suddenly twisting with something else. Rage, hunger. Elijah backed up, nearly tripping over the threshold. The man lunged at him, arms outstretched, and Elijah turned to bolt, but smashed right into someone else. There was a second man standing just outside the door, like he'd been waiting for the escape attempt. Elijah said he didn't even scream. He just twisted, shoved the guy, and ran for the path. He didn't look back, but he heard them, both of them, running, breathing hard, whispering something he couldn't make out. The worst part, he said, was that they never stepped into the light. Every time he glanced back, they were just beyond the reach of the lanterns, shadows with legs. He made it to the car, keys already in hand, and peeled out so fast he almost crashed into a tree. When he got to the main road, he didn't stop. He called the police while driving, voice shaking, words tumbling out too fast. The sheriff's office sent a cruiser, but by the time they got there, no one was around. Cabin 3 was empty. Inside there were footprints, a few pizza slices, but no people, no lights, no fingerprints. The weirdest part? The rental office for Frosted Oak said that cabin hadn't been rented in over a year. The name, phone number, and payment method were all fake. Prepaid gift card, disposable number, no trail. The police couldn't do anything, just like in my case. Elijah told me he didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. Said he kept dreaming of a hand grabbing his ankle in the dark. When he finished telling me the story, I didn't say much. I didn't need to. We both knew what it meant. Someone out there was using delivery apps to lure people in, not for money, not for food, for something else, something worse. He asked if I believed him. I told him I did. Every word, because I'd been in that hallway, and I'd heard the footsteps too. And the question that haunted me now haunted him. What would have happened if I hadn't run? What would have happened if he had tripped? Neither of us wanted to know the answer. There's something strange that happens when 2 people share a terrifying experience. Even if the details aren't identical, you can recognize it in each other's eyes. The way their voice dips when they talk about the dark, how their shoulders tense at the sound of creaking wood. That night at the car wash, after Elijah finished his story, he asked me if anything like that had ever happened to me. I told him yes, and that I hadn't been able to sleep the same way since. He looked relieved, like knowing someone else had stared into that same kind of fear made it a little less heavy. Then I told him something that made him go quiet again. I said, "There was another guy. Someone I met years ago when I used to work deliveries part-time. His story made my skin crawl worse than anything I'd heard. Worse than yours, worse than mine." Elijah leaned forward, like he needed to know what happened, like he needed to believe there was a pattern to it all. So I told him about Cliff Reynolds. Cliff was in his early 40s when I met him, wiry, always wore a cap low over his face, eyes like he'd seen things he couldn't forget. We worked together briefly at a warehouse job just outside Burlington, Vermont. I didn't know much about his past, but he kept to himself except for one time on break when someone brought up creepy delivery stories. That's when Cliff spoke up. His voice was quiet, like he wasn't sure he wanted to share. But once he started, the words came like water breaking through a dam. He said it happened when he was around 20. He used to deliver food for a local pizza place just for extra cash. Most nights were normal, boring even, but this one night stuck with him like a scar. It was just past 9 p.m. The store was winding down, and he got one last order. Paid in full, no tip, no special instructions. The address was out past town, which was already strange. Usually, people that far out didn't bother with delivery, but the system marked it as valid, so he got in his beat-up Civic and headed out. The road he took wasn't a real highway, not in the big city sense. Locals still called it the highway, but it was just a narrow two-lane stretch that snaked through the woods and hills. He remembered the stars that night, said they were so clear you could see the divide between the black treetops in the sky. No cars passed him, no houses, just miles of trees pressing close on both sides. When the GPS chimed, he was caught off guard. It didn't say to turn anywhere, just said, arrived. Cliff slowed the car, pulled onto the shoulder and checked both sides of the road. Nothing, just trees. He zoomed in on the map, thinking maybe the app glitched, but every app he checked said the same thing. This was the spot. That's when he saw a light, just a brief flicker between the trees. It was faint, like a lantern or an old flashlight, and gone before he could really focus on it. Thinking maybe it was the customer, he called the number. A man picked up, calm and casual. Cliff explained where he was, said he didn't see a house. The guy told him he was in the right place, said there was a small driveway just a little off the road, hard to spot, but there. Cliff asked which direction, and the man said, look to your left. You might have to walk in a bit. Then he hung up. Cliff said the silence after that was unreal. No bugs, no wind, just the hum of his engine and the faint sound of his own breath. He looked left, and sure enough there was a faint trail, not a driveway really, just a thin strip of dirt that looked like it had been dug out by hand. No tire marks, no gravel, just this crooked scar in the forest floor leading into the trees. That's when the light flashed again, deeper into the woods, and went out. Most people would have turned around. Cliff said he almost did. But part of him, the part that didn't want to go back to the shop and explain, he didn't deliver, won out. He got out, took the pizza bag, and walked to the edge of the forest. The air felt colder there, not breezy, just wrong. He said it was like walking into a room where something terrible had just happened, like the trees knew. He stood at the edge of the path and called out, hello? Nothing. He took 2 steps in, then 3. That's when he heard something. Leaves shifting, not far off, like someone moving just out of sight. He froze. The silence snapped tight around him. He knew, right then he knew, whatever was going on, it wasn't about pizza, it wasn't about delivery. It was a setup. That flickering light wasn't an accident. That path wasn't for people who were expected to leave. Cliff turned, set the food on a rock near the edge of the road, and walked quickly, very quickly, back to his car. As he opened the door, he heard it, a whisper, not in his ear but behind him, not a voice he could understand, just the shape of something human trying to sound close. He didn't look back. He floored the gas and didn't stop until he reached a gas station miles away. He didn't call the cops right away. Said he felt too stupid, like who was going to believe him. But the next day, he went back with a friend during daylight. They parked in the same spot, got out and looked for that path. Nothing. No dirt trail, no break in the trees, no sign that anyone had ever lived out there. It was like the woods had swallowed it up. The number from the order didn't work. It had been disconnected. The payment? Another gift card. No way to trace it. The store eventually wrote it off, but Cliff never forgot. He told me it was the reason he stopped doing delivery altogether. That and the dreams. The worst dream, he said, was the one where he didn't stop at the edge, where he followed that path deeper and deeper until the trees closed behind him and he realized he wasn't walking alone anymore. When I finished telling Elijah the story, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, staring out at the lot, like he expected the woods to grow up around the concrete. Then he said, so, it's not just one place. It's not just one person. I nodded. Seems like someone's playing a long game, different states, different apps, but the same pattern. And the truth is, we don't know how many others there have been. How many people went too far down that hallway, stepped too deep into the cabin, followed the wrong light into the trees. Maybe some never came back. Maybe no one knew they were missing. But we know, and now so do you. As the author of Deliveries After Midnight, there's one truth that echoes through each of these stories. Danger doesn't always wear a mask or come rushing toward you with flashing lights and dramatic music. Sometimes it's quiet. It texts politely. It hides behind dim lights, fake names, and prepaid gift cards. And sometimes it waits in places where you least expect it. Marcus, Elijah, and Cliff. 3 men who weren't looking for trouble, they were just working. They weren't thrill seekers or ghost hunters. They were everyday people making ends meet, delivering food in the dead of night, trusting that the world was mostly good. And maybe it is, but these stories remind us that evil doesn't need an invitation, it just needs an opening. The lesson here is simple but urgent. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, if the place is too quiet, too dark, too isolated, you don't need permission to walk away. No delivery is worth your life. No $5 tip justifies ignoring that pit in your stomach. Technology makes it easier than ever to send strangers to our doorstep, and while most orders are harmless, all it takes is one with bad intentions to change everything. Be cautious. Be skeptical. Always stay in well-lit areas. Don't go inside unfamiliar buildings or homes. Keep someone on the phone. Share your location with a friend. Stay alert. Stay safe. And to those who've listened, to those who've stayed through each chapter of this dark journey, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, and on behalf of Enigma of the Unknown, I want you to know how much I appreciate your time, your curiosity, and your trust. These stories aren't just meant to scare you. They're meant to warn you, to remind you that even in our modern world, some doors should never be opened. So the next time you're out late, headlights slicing through empty streets, and your GPS tells you to turn down a path that wasn't there before, remember Marcus, remember Elijah, remember Cliff, and remember that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't from legends or nightmares. They're real, and they know how to use apps. Stay aware, stay alive, and as always, thank you for listening to Enigma of the Unknown.